This video will teach you how to paint a portrait from start to finish. It's meant to help students with a specific project, but it can help other artists too. The first step is to tone your canvas. Toning your canvas serves a few different purposes. First, it gets rid of the white quickly so your painting looks more finished. It can also help to create lighting or a mood in your finished painting. It can also be helpful in establishing skin tones for portraits. I recommend toning your canvas orange or purple. Orange will make your skin tone look well lit and glowy. It works well for lighter skin tones. Purple will create a darker, moodier portrait. Some people like to use it for darker skin tones, but the choice is ultimately up to you. To tone my canvas, I mix my color and then mix water into it. I use more water to spread the paint on my canvas to create a very thin layer. I alternate moving my brush up and down and side to side until my canvas is smooth. Once your canvas is toned and dry, you need to draw your portrait and any other symbols you're including. Draw using a wooden pencil, not mechanical, to prevent smudging. Then go over all of your lines in a thin tipped Sharpie. Here's my finished drawn portrait. Now we're painting in the background. We start by outlining the portrait and symbols with a thin liner brush. We want to get right up next to all of the shapes so that we can't see any of the toned canvas or the Sharpie peeking through. Take your time and go slow to get it right. Once you've outlined all of your shapes, you can paint in the rest of the background with a bigger brush. You'll notice that I have some thinner areas where my toned canvas peeks through, which I don't want, so I'll go back and paint a second coat over those areas. Now I'll paint the symbols behind my subject. When we paint, we usually work back to front, so that's why I start with the background. You can see that I've already started painting in some of my symbols. Specifically, I painted the rod of the umbrella because that's further back in space. I also painted in the shadows of my sunflower petals because I prefer to paint from the darkest to the lightest value. I'm also painting from darkest to lightest on the umbrella fabric. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, so at this point I've painted in most of the flower petals. Because yellow acrylic is very transparent, I can see some of my Sharpie lines through the paint, but I don't mind it in this case. Now I'm painting in the center of the sunflower, also from darkest to lightest. I'm also going to add some light yellow highlights to the petals. That's it for the background, and now I'm ready to work on the face. When painting the face, we begin with the shadows. When we're painting the shadows, it's important that we study our photo really closely to identify the darkest areas. You can see it really well in areas like under the chin, but there are areas of shadow all over the face. To help you see the shadows, squint while you look at your photo. The darker areas will be more obvious. I have an edited version of my photo here to help you see what I'm talking about. In this version, it's easier to see that there are shadows on the sides of the face, around the eyes, and along the sides of the nose. If you're familiar with makeup techniques, we'll be painting in shadows everywhere that you would contour. Your shadow color should be very purpley. You can see that really clearly in the shadows on my neck. I mixed my shadow color using almost equal amounts of red, yellow, and blue. I used a little of both the warm and cool blues. Since I'm very pale, I used a little bit of white in my shadow color, but you may not need to depending on your subject. I'm painting my shadows with a mid-sized brush. I paint my color under my chin, on the sides of my neck, and along the collar of my shirt. I have shadows along the sides of my jaw and under my bottom lip. For my nose, I'll add shadow to the sides of my nostrils and between them. Later, you'll see me paint shadows along the sides of my nose. I also should have painted a shadow across my nose between my eyes, so you'll see that I added it later. I'm adding shadows around my eyes, but pay attention to your subject. Everyone will have a shadow above their eyes, but people will have different levels of shadow underneath. Before we move any further with our skin, we need to paint some details. Specifically, we need to start with the eyes, nose, and mouth. Let's dive into the eyes first. With the eyes, I recommend starting by painting the tear ducts. I mix up a cool pink by adding a tiny bit of blue, and then I'm painting it into the inner corners of the eyes. Use a tiny brush for all of this. For the eyeballs, I start by painting the shadowed areas in the outer corners of the eyes. I mix up a purplish gray using white, a tiny bit of black, and a tiny bit of red, which will be painted into the corners of both eyes. Then I keep gradually adding more white to the shadow color and painting it closer and closer to the center of the eye. Before I finish, I'm going back in with a little bit of pure white right outside the irises, and I blend it a little with my finger. For the irises, I mix up a greenish yellowish color because that's what my eyes look like, but you'll decide for yourself what color you paint your eyes. I also added a bluer ring around the outside of my irises and some yellower dots on the inside to add some dimension. For my pupils, I just used some black paint. Be really careful when you're painting the shape. To finish the eyeballs, use a couple of dots of white in the same spot on each eye. It makes your portrait look more lifelike. The last step for the eyes is to paint the eyelids. For my skin tone, I took some of my purple shadow color and I added some yellow, white, and red. I start by painting the skin tone right along the upper eyelid. I'm letting a little bit of my purple shadow show through on either side. I paint the same color under my eyes. You can see how the purple shows through a little bit to create a darker value. Between my eyes and eyebrows, I go in with some more of my skin tone. Make sure you leave a line of your shadow to represent the crease in your eyelid. Once my main skin tone is painted in, I lighten the color with a little bit of white, and I'm adding a few highlights to my eyelids and around my eyes to add some dimension. I tend to blend my paint with my fingers, but you don't have to do that. Next, we'll paint the nose. My first video for the nose didn't record, so I redid my sketch on a piece of paper to recreate my painting. I should have started by painting my nostrils black, but I forgot and did it later. I start by mixing a skin tone from my purple shadows again. This is darker than my actual skin tone since I'm still working on the shadows. I'm adding some white, red, and yellow to my purple and adjusting till I have the color I want. I started by painting that color on the sides of my nostrils and along the bridge of my nose. I also painted up my nose to my forehead and under my eyebrows, and also underneath my nose. Start to add highlights, I add some more white and red to my skin tone, and I paint it along the center of the bridge of my nose and on the edges of my nostrils. I'm also adding it under my eyes, on my cheeks, and on my forehead, and between my nose and lips. I'm going to keep lightening and warming up my skin tone to add highlights until I like how my nose looks. I use my fingers to blend this area a lot, but that's totally optional. Now let's paint the mouth. Our mouth color always relates to our skin tone unless we're wearing lipstick. I always start my lip color by mixing some red and blue into my skin tone that I already have mixed. I'm starting with the shadows on the lips, so I want it to be a little purpley. I'm going to use that color on my top lip and along the top and bottom of my bottom lip. For my lighter color, I add a little more white and red. I'm painting it along the top of my top lip and the center of my bottom lip. To add some highlight, I'm mixing a little more white into my lip color and adding a few dots to the top of my top lip and the center of my bottom lip. At the end, I decided that I wanted the space between my top and bottom lip to be darker, so I mixed up a shadow color with red, blue, and a little bit of black into my existing lip color, and I painted it in the center of my mouth where my two lips meet. After the details, the next step is to paint the rest of the skin. This is a new day, so I need to mix my skin tone fresh. I'm starting with more of a shadow color, so I mix a color that's still purpley but a little lighter and redder than my existing shadows. I'm painting that color around the edges of my face and neck, overlapping my existing shadows a little bit. I'm going to be making my paint progressively lighter and redder and repeat this process, working a little closer to the center of my face each time. You need to pay close attention to where the shadows and highlights of your face are so that you don't over-lighten an area. make your paint too light too quickly, or you'll have a hard time blending your highlights to the rest of your skin tone. At this stage, I'm using my highlights to really sculpt the high points of my face. I kind of forgot about my neck as I worked, so I had to go back later. Since my current skin color is so light, I had to remix and make it darker. Now, I'm just doing some finishing touches and softening some of my shadows. I'm also doing some final sculpting and adjusting the high and low points of my face with some different values. The last step on the face is to paint all of the details. That's things like the eyelashes, piercings, and freckles or moles. I only need to add eyelashes to my portrait, so that's all I'm doing in this video. Instead of using straight black paint, I'm mixing a little bit of yellow and some red into it to make a dark brown. This looks a little more natural than just black paint. When painting small details, use the tiniest brush possible. To keep the tip nice and pointy, roll the end of your paintbrush in your paint. Barely touch your paintbrush to your canvas to make a thin line. Eyelashes extend outward like sun rays from the center of the eye. They all have a slight curve to them. Pay attention to how your subject's eyelashes look as you paint. The more lines you paint, the fuller your eyelashes will look, so be careful not to overdo it. If you're painting any other details, you'll use a similar technique. I'm saving my eyebrows for when I paint my hair, so you'll see that later. That's it for the face. Next, I'll paint the hair and eyebrows. When we paint the hair, we do it in a few steps. First, we mix a darker version of your hair color. We're going to use this as the base of the hair before we paint lighter strands of hair on top. Focus the darker color on the hair along the sides of your neck and hair that is closer to your face. I highly recommend looking at a photo of yourself, like I'm doing here, to look at how your hair falls and where the shadows are. Next, mix a lighter version of your hair color. You can see that I added some yellow, red, and a tiny bit of white to the color I already had to make my hair blonder. I'm painting that color wherever I currently don't have any paint representing my hair. I'll also paint it in some of the areas I want to start to lighten. I'll also use this color in my eyebrows. When I paint them, I try and move my brush in the direction that the hairs grow. Later, I'll add a few hairs in a highlight color to give them some dimension. Next, I mix an even lighter version of my hair color by adding red and yellow to brighten it, and I start to add areas of highlight to my hair. Pay attention to the photo or mirror that you're using to see where to place the highlights. continue to mix lighter versions of my hair color using white to add more highlights. I'm using this color to start to define the individual strands of my hair. Keep going with this process until you're happy with your results. Towards the end, I went back with a darker color and added more texture to my hairline with short, thin brush strokes. It will make the hair look more natural on the head. As a last step, I like to go back into the hair with a thin brush to add some detail to the strands. I did this in my case because I thought the strands looked too chunky, but you don't have to do this step. To finish your painting, paint in any symbols you haven't done already. For me, that's the symbols in front of my body since I worked back to front. If you feel comfortable with your painting abilities, feel free to end the video now. I've included a very sped up recording of me painting in the rest of my symbols in case you'd like to see my process. I'm doing the same thing that I've been talking about the entire video, painting back to front and dark to light, painting in small details last. I did take a shortcut right at the end and use a Posca marker to add the text into the book, which you can do for your details if you'd like. Here's what my portrait looks like all finished. If you're my student and you watched all the way to the end, good job. If you're not my student, thank you for watching and I hope this is helpful.